A billion-dollar empire just got a $100 million fine. Starbucks' golden rule just cracked. Howard Schultz steps off the plane in Sydney, just as the first headlines hit his phone. Starbucks faces global backlash over new policy. The press is already circling. Schultz had spent decades crafting the Starbucks experience. A symphony of ambience, service, and caffeine designed to make every customer feel like royalty. But Australia was no ordinary market. It was a land where coffee was not just a drink, but a way of life, shaped by generations of Italian immigrants who had turned espresso into an art form. The fatal mistake was not just entering a market with a foreign product, but doing so with the arrogance of a conqueror. Schultz declared Australia would be the next America, a nation ripe for the taking, its coffee culture naive and unrefined. Yet, beneath the surface, a revolution was already brewing, one that Starbucks would soon learn the hard way. Starbucks' arrival in Australia was not just a business expansion, it was a cultural invasion. The company targeted prime real estate with surgical precision, buying up entire blocks in Sydney and Melbourne, determined to reshape the coffee landscape. But what they failed to see was that Australia's coffee culture was not a blank canvas, waiting to be painted in Seattle's colors. The company's financial architecture was built on a foundation of steel and ambition. Starbucks committed to company-owned stores only, refusing to franchise and instead burning through $1 million every week to dominate the market. They believed in buying share, not earning it, and in the beginning, it seemed to be working until the cracks began to show. Australia was not a market to be conquered. It was a culture to be understood. The nation had spent decades perfecting its espresso rituals, where every barista was an artist and every cup a masterpiece. Starbucks, however, arrived with a one-size-fits-all approach, offering venti lattes and automated brewing systems that felt more like fast food than fine coffee. The fatal paradox was clear. Starbucks had spent years perfecting the art of the latte in America, where milk dominated and espresso was an afterthought. But in Australia, espresso was sacred. The very foundation of their coffee culture was built on precision, tradition, and a deep appreciation for the craft. Starbucks' approach was a cultural insult, wrapped in a green apron. Schultz's vision was simple. Starbucks would bring the world together through coffee. But in Australia, the world was already together, just not in the way he imagined. The locals didn't need a corporate coffee experience. They needed a connection to their heritage, their history, and their passion for the craft. And Starbucks, with its corporate uniformity, was the last thing they wanted. The financial gamble was staggering. Starbucks poured millions into a market that didn't need them, buying real estate and dominating corners with identical stores. But what they failed to realize was that Australia's coffee culture was not a market to be dominated. It was a community to be respected, and respect, it turned out, was something Starbucks had never learned to give. The first cracks in the facade appeared when customers began to notice. The espresso was too dark, the milk too sweet, and the service too slow. The venti lattes, once a symbol of Starbucks grandeur, became a mockery in a nation that valued precision over size. The company had built an empire on the idea that one size could fit all. But Australia was about to teach them a different lesson. Starbucks' refusal to franchise was both their greatest strength and their downfall. By owning every store, they maintained control, but at a cost. The company burned through millions every week, buying market share that didn't exist. They were spending like a conqueror, not a visionary, and the bill was coming due faster than they could pay it. The gamble was not just financial, it was cultural. Starbucks believed that their model, their experience, their very philosophy was universal. But Australia proved them wrong. The nation's coffee culture was not a market to be conquered. It was a legacy to be honored. And in the end, Starbucks' arrogance would cost them more than they ever imagined. This is just the beginning. Subscribe to see more amazing content. Fire. The story of Starbucks' arrival in Australia is more than a tale of corporate arrogance. It's a lesson in humility. A company that had once been invincible learned the hard way that the world's most sophisticated coffee markets are not to be dominated, but to be understood. And in the end, It was Australia's passion for coffee that would humble a giant. In the quiet suburbs of post-war Melbourne, a generation of Italian immigrants arrived with one secret weapon. The art of espresso. Their small, steam-filled kitchens became the birthplace of a culture that would one day make Australia's coffee scene the envy of the world, yet no one in Seattle ever saw it coming. By the 1970s, these immigrants' children had grown up with a language of coffee that was as precise as their parents' hand movements. They demanded not just caffeine, but ritual. The barista wasn't just a server. They were a storyteller, crafting each shot with the same devotion as a master painter. The Australians didn't just drink coffee, they studied it. They dissected the foam, debated the grind, and turned their backyards into battlegrounds for the perfect brew. This wasn't a pastime. It was a way of life, passed down through generations like a sacred tradition. Then, in 2000, a giant arrived on their shores. Howard Schultz, the man who had built an empire on the idea of the third place, strode into Sydney like he owned the city. His stores were sleek, modern, and expensive, designed to be a universal experience. But Australia had already invented its own. Schultz's team had spent months studying the Australian market. They concluded there was no coffee culture here, just a nation of people who drank tea. So they rolled out their signature menu. Large cups, sweet syrups, and a slow, ritualistic service that felt more like a luxury experience than a quick pick-me-up. Meanwhile, in the heart of Melbourne's CBD, a new coffee phenomenon was taking shape, the flat white. A drink so perfectly balanced that it became a national obsession. It wasn't just coffee. It was a statement, a rebellion against the bland, corporate offerings flooding the streets. The flat white wasn't just a drink. It was a cultural blueprint. The ratio of milk to coffee was sacred. 20 milliliters of velvety foam to a double ristretto. Too much foam, and it became a latte. Too little, and it was just coffee. The Australians had turned something simple into an art form, and they weren't about to let anyone mess with it. Starbucks venti latte. A drink so large it could double as a water bottle was an insult to their sensibilities. The Australians didn't want convenience. They wanted craftsmanship. They wanted to see the barista's hands, to feel the weight of the cup, to taste the difference between a well-pulled shot and a mediocre one. The Australians had their own third place, not the corporate coffee chain, but the neighborhood cafe. These weren't just places to grab a drink. They were community hubs. The owner was a friend, the barista a local legend, and every cup told a story. It was personal, it was authentic, and it was everything Starbucks wasn't. Starbucks market research had missed something critical. Australia wasn't a blank slate. It was a nation of 3,000 independent cafes, each with its own identity, its own secrets, and its own loyal following. These weren't just businesses. They were institutions, deeply embedded in the fabric of Australian life. The Australians didn't need Starbucks. They had their own coffee culture, one that was as complex and layered as their landscape. It was a culture built on respect, on craft, on the quiet pride of doing something well. And when the giant arrived, it didn't bring a gift. It brought a challenge. The locals didn't just reject Starbucks, they redefined what coffee could be. They turned a simple drink into a symbol of their identity, their passion, and their refusal to be boxed in. And in doing so, they taught a global giant a lesson in humility that would cost them $100 million. But that story is for another chapter. For now, let's look at the quiet revolution that happened in the shadows, where a nation of coffee lovers refused to be ignored. They didn't just drink coffee, they shaped it, they perfected it, and they made it their own. And when the giant came calling, they were ready. Starbucks deployed a ruthless cluster strategy to dominate the streets. They flooded every corner with identical stores. The goal was to choke out local competitors instantly. Instead, they cannibalized their own thin profit margins completely. The saturation didn't create a monopoly. It created a graveyard of wasted real estate. They refused to adapt their signature dark roast for the local palate. The coffee tasted burnt to Australian drinkers. Furthermore, The cup sizes were culturally inappropriate. A massive venti was seen as an insult, not a luxury. They brought American volume to a market that valued precision. The service speed was another fatal error. Australians preferred a quick, grab-and-go espresso ritual. Starbucks insisted on a leisurely, sit-down experience. The line waited too long for a simple drink. It disrupted the natural flow of the daily commute. Speed was sacrificed for an image of comfort. Starbucks brought push-button automation to a country that prized manual craftsmanship. The automated machines could not replicate the art of a skilled barista. They alienated local barista champions. In July 2008, a brutal Monday morning memo shook the foundations of Starbucks' Australian operations, with 61 stores instantly closed and 685 jobs lost, marking the largest single-day retreat in global retail history. The memo was a stark reminder of the hubris that had driven Starbucks' aggressive expansion into the Australian market. With the company's refusal to adapt to local tastes and preferences, in a rare display of accountability, Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz publicly acknowledged the company's arrogance and hubris, confessing that they had not respected the Australian coffee culture, and that their failure was a masterclass in accountable leadership. The Phoenix sale, which saw the company sell its remaining 23 stores to the Withers Group for a fraction of sunk cost, marked a turning point for Starbucks, forcing a pivot to franchising and local menu autonomy to survive in the competitive Australian market. The enduring legacy of Starbucks' failure in Australia has become a Harvard case study on cultural intelligence, proving that in a globalized world, the local customer is the only moat that matters, and that a company's success is not solely dependent on its global brand recognition. What is the dark truth behind this event? Share your theory below and watch our next investigation. Welcome! Before we begin, hit subscribe so you don't miss our daily updates. Bell Part 2 is dropping tomorrow. Subscribe for notifications. Loudspeaker.